Thank you very much, Chrissy. Look, I'd like to talk to you today to start off the conference with myths and misconceptions of the Northern Perth Basin. Perhaps what we should start off is, what is a myth anyway? So some of the more interesting definitions that I found up on the web was, the first one was a widely held but false belief or idea. Now, I'm not actually that sure that a myth has to be false. I always thought the best myths had a bit of truth in amongst them. So what I actually prefer as my best definition is a myth is a misrepresentation of the truth. So I reckon we go with this one. So the first myth, number one, the North Perth Basin is gassy. Now what I have shown there in this nice big pie chart is the total recoverable volumes by phase in the North Perth Basin. 80% of the total recoverable volumes in the North Perth Basin are gas. The other 20% split between oil and condensate. So pretty much on a whole of basin basis, it's not a myth, it's actual truth. But there's always a lot more to it when you start digging in. Not all the plays are equal. And for those of you that aren't geologists, which is probably the vast majority of you, a play is something that kids do. But when you're a geologist, you're allowed to play all the time. And instead, a geologist play is a set of rocks of a certain age. And what I have here is a graph of, I've got on this y-axis my geological age, and then my discovered volumes on the x-axis. We have a look at the top here, the youngest rocks, and I say youngest, these rocks are actually 250 million years old, so young for geologists, but not young for most people here. We see there is a decent amount of oil being found, especially in the Cockatoo Shale, but also about a third of the hydrocarbons in the Dongra sandstone are oil on a BOE basis, that's barrel of oil equivalent. As we get older and older and get out to the kingier play, which I'm certain you'll hear a bit more about later on in some of today's talks, but that kingier play is where the Waitsia, West Erregulla, South Erregulla, Lockyer Deep discoveries are all hosted. As we get deeper and deeper and older, around about this time, it's 290 million years old, it becomes more and more gas prone. So what we're seeing is chronological or time-based variations in the hydrocarbon phase. But what about spatial or geographic-based variations in the phase? So to have a look at that, I've drawn a line down the centre north-south of the North Perth Basin. It's following a feature called the Mountain Bridge Fault. And what we're going to do is have a look on the east side and then the west side. But first off, we've got to move away from this geographic Landsat view, and I want to bring us into the subsurface. So let's have a look at what the geology is like. So this is a view of the shape of the base of the Northern Perth Basin. And blue areas, hey, that was good. Blue areas here are where it's deep, or it's where the North Perth Basin is the thickest. The brown areas, where it's the base of the North Perth Basin is shallow, so it's at its thinnest here. So what we're going to do now is have a look at what's happening on the eastern side in terms of the hydrocarbons. And what we see is it's not 80% gas. Out to the east of the Mountain Bridge Fault, it is 95% gas in terms of what's been discovered in the North Perth Basin. And also, interestingly, the wells are quite deep, generally greater than 3,000 metres depth to reach these targets. So what happens when we go off to the west side? Are we still going to see these high levels of gas coming through there? No, what we actually start to see, the wells are generally shallower, generally less than 2,500 metres deep, or 2.5 kilometres below sea level. But we now see an even split, roughly 50-50, between oil and gas on a barrel of oil equivalent basis on what has been discovered. So, in terms of the first myth, that the North Perth Basin is gassy, on a whole of basin basis, it's not a myth, it's fact. There is far more discovered barrel of oil equivalent of gas than what there is of oil in the North Perth Basin. But it depends on where you look and also what play or when it was deposited, and you go through and have a look. There is definitely an opportunity for companies and investors. If you can find a company that's willing to head out west to chase oil, there is a great opportunity there. But if you're looking for gas, head east. The second myth, the Northern Perth Basin has run its race and there's nothing more to discover. Now, the North Perth Basin, for those that were listening to me last year, has got a history of resurgence, of new plays coming through and then being drilled out, becoming mature, nothing more to be found, and then additional plays coming on that. So what we have here is, in blue in the centre tracks, the Dongra and Wodgina formation plays. That's where the Dongra gas field and in the 2000s to 2008, Hovia, Jingamaya, Cliff Head, all of those wonderful little oil fields and small gas fields like Apium were discovered. And then from about 2008, no further discoveries in the Northern Perth Basin for the Dongra and Wodgina plays. But we have the discovery at Senecio 3, which found the Waitsia gas field, followed up by West Erregulla, Lockyer Deep, South Erregulla, these giant gas fields that recently been found. And we can see that suddenly this graph is shooting up with a different track, a different set of plays coming through. But this is all looking at what has been done. And the myth is about what's happening in the future. There's nothing more to find in the North Perth Basin because these explorers are really good and they found it all. Well, the reality is, if we have a look at the identified prospects and leads, so features that are yet to be drilled, and plot those up as risked prospect and lead volumes on a million barrels of oil equivalent basis, there is over 400 million barrels of oil predicted to be found in the North Perth Basin on a risked basis. This indicates that the prospect and lead inventory in the North Perth Basin is far from exhausted. There is still a lot to be discovered in the North Perth Basin. But perhaps the real question is not whether or not the North Perth Basin has run its race, but where are the next discoveries going to be found in the North Perth Basin? So where I think the next discoveries are going to be found in the North Perth Basin is to the east, closer to the Darling Fault. We had the Lockyer Deep discovery that was made this time last year on the first day of the Goodall Conference. That's heading closer and closer to the Darling Fault, and I think that's what we're going to find with these giant gas fields. They're going to move further and further across to the east. A really interesting one is the Jurassic gas and oil play. This has been tested. It was tested by Whoppet in 1971, and it discovered, but it never really flowed well until recently when Whalering number 5 flowed at a very high flow rate, and the whole Jurassic system, based on that rediscovery, needs to be re-explored systematically. There's a great opportunity there in the central part of the Northern Perth Basin. And finally, following on from my Go West theme for oil, we have the Waitsia play, the one that has got that really high flow rate. If you follow that, instead of being on the western side of the Mountain Bridge Fault, on the eastern side, follow that across to the west. There is a huge opportunity there to look for oil that flows at really good rates. So I think they are three areas where there's a lot of potential in the future in the North Perth Basin. A third myth, and I love this one, is that good porosity makes for a good flow rate. Now, in the North Perth Basin, there has been recently a lot of flow tests that have flowed at incredibly high rates. And I've got the top 5 flow rates here for the last decade. Coming in on 5th at 75 million standard cubic feet a day was Whalering 5. Just pipping it for 4th place at 78 million standard cubic feet a day was South Erregulla 1. In equal second, we have West Erregulla 3 and Waitsia 4, both doing 90 million standard cubic feet a day on a well test. And far and away, the winner of the North Perth Basin flow rate stakes is Lockyer Deep at 117 million standard cubic feet a day. But we need to keep this in perspective. The world record is held by Antelope number 2, which flowed at 705 million standard cubic feet a day in Papua New Guinea. But there's a bit of this, my flow rate is bigger than yours, going on in the Perth Basin amongst the companies there, or at least so it seems. And that is quite possible. But there are also, in addition to that, some very good geological and engineering reasons for flowing at the maximum possible rate for these wells. Why is the flow rate important, and why do companies get so focused on it? Flow rate is a measure, simply, of how quickly our gas or oil could travel from our reservoir out to our wellbore and then up into our production facility. Here's an important point. Flow rate is not determined by porosity. Porosity is simply a measure of how much oil and gas the rock or the reservoir can store. Permeability is the measure of the flow rate. And it's this permeability which connects these pore spaces that is the key function in the rocks. I've got a little diagram here on my first image here of rocks. We've got little sand grains really tightly packed together, no pore space at all. We have a non-porous, non-permeable rock which has got no storage capacity and no flow capacity. In the middle, we can see the little blue pore spaces there, but they're isolated, they're not connected. So we have our porosity, we have the storage, but we have no flow rate because it's stored but cannot get out. Then we have our third example here to the right, the rocks that geologists love to find. We have nice large pore spaces, then they're all connected. We have great storage capacity and a really good opportunity for that hydrocarbon to flow from those rocks. So why is this permeability flow rate stuff so important to a company? Well, the higher the flow rate, essentially the fewer the number of wells you need to have producing on a field to get to your production facility's capacity. The fewer wells you have on a field, and when wells cost between $5 to $10 million a piece, the lower capital expenditure you need to make on that field to get to your facility flow rate, which means the lower the capital expenditure, the more profit your companies are making. So flow rate is important on the economics of an oil or gas field. And generally, high porosity reservoirs have high permeabilities, but this is not always the case. We can see here, this is our line of best fit on what is the relationship between porosity and permeability in the North Perth Basin. And while it's a line of best fit, not all of our points of porosity and permeability are sitting nicely on that. And I'll just quickly explain part of this graph. This green area here is good permeability, where the permeability is greater than 10 millidarcies. Millidarcy is just a measure of how fast the rocks flow. Then we have our orange area, which is between 1 to 10 millidarcies. We're starting to get into the ugly area, where it flows, but not brilliant. And then we get into the bad area, less than 1 millidarcy of permeability. And remember how I was talking about porosity being the measurement that a lot of companies talk about? If we take just one of the numbers here, 11% porosity in the North Perth Basin, we find that our permeability range, the amount that it can flow for 11% porosity, ranges between 800 millidarcies to 0.2 of a millidarcy. So at 11% porosity, what we can have in terms of our flow rate could be the good, the bad, or the ugly. We cannot tell. So just from that one number, it's a little bit confusing. And this permeability is one of the key measurements to look for in ASX releases, not the porosity. And permeability is very often not reported. So just to conclude here, we've had a look at 3 myths on the North Perth Basin. The first is that the North Perth Basin is gassy. And it's true, it is gassy. But as I said before, it is a misrepresentation of the truth. The Northern Perth Basin is gassy in areas, but there are places where the Northern Perth Basin is oily, and if you're looking for oil, those are the places you want to be at. The second myth was it's not worth investing in North Perth Basin explorers anymore because it's all been found, and let's go and have a look at some other companies. That's not the truth. It's absolutely a myth. There is still a lot more potential in the companies that are exploring for hydrocarbons in the North Perth Basin to make large discoveries for many years to come. But the key is, it's not just going to be in today's hotspots. There are a lot of new areas that have got great potential for the future. The third myth, which I just talked about, was that a good porosity measured in the world means it will flow at great rates. Absolutely a misconception. Porosity doesn't drive flow rate, permeability drives our flow rates. However, there is some correlation between permeability and porosity. Look, I'd like to thank RIU for the opportunity to come back for a second year in a row. I really appreciate that, and I hope everyone here has a great day and you hear some really interesting talks on some great companies. Thank you, Chrissy.